again, talking about my tour that I do, one of the things that dominates my tour is women. I'd like to think it's because of me and who I am, but actually, the reality is that when we did the investigator series, the Radio Times did a review, and actually, it showed that 80% of the viewers were women. And I just find that very interesting. I haven't found a piece of work that's been done around why is it that women consume crime to the degree that they do. And in fact, you look at some of the really dangerous people in prison who have committed some of the worst possible crimes against women, yet women write to them, women declare their love to them, women want to visit them. What is it? And I give an explanation, and I'll be interested to see whether your response is the same as mine. Why is it that women consume crime far, far more? I mean, the amount of women that come to my talk, and when the men are in the audience, it's normally because they've been dragged along by a partner. Why do they consume it to the degree that they do?
Yeah, it's a good question. I absolutely second that. So we briefly talked about CrimeCon. I know you've been a guest on CrimeCon a couple of years ago, and I've done it several years, and it's the same. So the audience are overwhelmingly female. I'd say probably more than 3/4. And it is quite baffling because men obviously commit far more violence. The prison population, I think, is something like 85 to 90% male. And I'm not fully sure, to be perfectly honest with you, Mark. My best guess is that, firstly, women, I think, are more naturally connected to their emotions. So they're more curious about thought processes that lead to extreme situations like violence. I think that's one thing. I think another thing is that women are probably overall more fearful of being victims because women are victims of more crimes, particularly certain types of crimes like sexual assaults. Obviously, domestic violence would be another one. So I think that it's a combination of those things. It's a curiosity about the psychological makeup, and I think also most of us, I think all of us, I'd say, have quite potentially dark thoughts, but we all have kind of social barriers or restrictions, so we don't act upon them. We don't hurt people that we might want to hurt, like our bosses or ex-partners, whatever, even though we have the thoughts. And I think women are more interested in learning about the people that don't have those barriers and that do the things that we would think but we would never do. So I think it's a combination of all of those things. Just going back to something else that you said, Mark, which was so hybristophilia. I'm not sure if you've heard that term, but that's the psychiatric terminology for women who fall in love with dangerous men.
No, I've not heard that. Was it so? The hybristophilia?
Hybristophilia, yeah, hybristophilia. So
brilliant.
We psychiatrists, we like to sound cleverer than we are, so we always put Latin terminology for things for no reason. So hybristo comes from the Greek word hubris and philia for attraction towards. And there's definite. I think it's quite hard to answer the question why these women fall in love with serial killers, but I can answer the question: what are the kind of contributory factors? And one unfortunate truth is that most of these women themselves were victims of some sort of domestic abuse or violence, usually from ex-partners, sometimes from their own parents. And so I think these women drift towards what's familiar rather than what is logical. And I think I said this before about both men and women who are victims of violence when they're younger. So they kind of repeat these patterns, sometimes subconsciously, but there's a twist. And the twist is, if you're in love with a serial killer, especially a high profile one, you get to control and dominate the relationship because you control the parameters. You know where your man is at all times. You get to decide when you visit. You get to decide what items you take into prison. So it's almost like you're trying to gain control, perhaps from the first time in your life. So I think that's one element of it. I think another element is this overly mothering instinct that is there for everybody. Arguably females more than males, and arguably some individual females more than anybody else. And it's like a savior complex. And who else is the best case example to try and save than a mass murderer? If you're going to be the person that turns somebody around, then that's like the ultimate goal to aim for, right? And my final thing I'd say about this is that I do think there's a small proportion. I do think it's small, but it's definitely there, of women who do it for the press attention. So you do get women who start relationships with very dangerous men, and then very shortly they want a book deal or they want to do a documentary about them. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I think it's only a small proportion, but I think it exists.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, when I'm asked that question about why is dominated by females. The thing that I often say in quite simplistic form is that I think the female mind is very different to the male mind. We tend to see things as black and white. We tend to see things as a solution very quickly and move on, whereas women will often contemplate, think about things, overanalyze it, and want to fully understand and get in the head of the individual that it relates to. And I think as a result of that, they want to know more detail, and that might then feed into that aspect of why they communicate on the level. And I suppose when I think about it, sometimes I go back to those my very early policing days when I remember in uniform I'd go out and there'd be a domestic violence incident on a Saturday night or a Sunday, and the female partner had been assaulted, and you'd separate them, and she'd say, I don't want to make an allegation, and that would be a repetitiveness over and over. Of course, policing's now changed because there's a zero arrest policy in relation to domestic violence, and you don't need a complainant to say I'm going to make an allegation, because rightfully so, they're in an environment where we know it's incredibly difficult for women to, and men of course, who are in domestic violence situations, to be able to talk and support that. So I think policing's made a huge progress in relation to that. It is incredibly difficult, but I do think women consume the crime genre at a level which is far exceeds any kind of like thought process. I think quite why, and it's always a struggle when you think to yourself, what is it that somebody would want to communicate with somebody who is so utterly brutal and violent and horrible? But it's not simple, is it? I suppose the answer is sometimes we try to simplify things, and sometimes things are just quite complicated.
Yeah, and not everything can be explained. So I suppose what you were just saying made me think about empathy. I think it's fair to say that women are naturally more empathetic than men, generally speaking. And I suppose if you stretch that, then empathy means that they've got more. The reason that they might, or one of the reasons that they consume more true crime, could be that they have empathy with the victims, but also maybe empathy with the perpetrator, not excusing their actions, but wanting, as you said before, to understand their thought processes. I think that's connected. It's curiosity, but it's also empathy.